of programs covering books, authors, and the publishing industry. Write us with your comments or suggestions at 400 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C. 20001, or call us at area code 202-626-4898. This is a book written by the daughter of aviator Charles Lindbergh. Under a Wing is Reeve Lindbergh's memoir of life in the famous household headed by Charles and his wife, author Morrow Lindbergh. Earlier this month, their youngest child spoke at Water Street Bookstore in Exeter, New Hampshire. Under a Wing is our biography selection this weekend.
This is on, I assume. Okay. Good evening and welcome to Water Street Bookstore. Tonight we are delighted to have Reeve Lindbergh here to read from her new book, Under a Wing, her loving memoir of growing up as the youngest child of Charles Lindbergh and Morrow Lindbergh. It is a remarkable portrait of her two famous parents, as individuals, as a couple, and as mother and father to Reeve, her sister, and three brothers. Moving back and forth between her childhood in Connecticut and her adult life in Vermont, Reeve offers us glimpses into a life filled with family adventures, happiness, and sorrow. It is in her gift of sharing the memories that bind this incredible family together that makes Under a Wing such a poignant tribute to the Lindberghs and the Morrows, those that have died and those that survive. Reeve is the author of two novels, The Names of the Mountains and Moving to the Country, as well as numerous children's books. She lives in Vermont with her husband, writer Nathaniel Tripp, and their family. After the reading, there will be an opportunity for you to ask Reeve questions, and then we'll be moving next door where you can purchase the book, and Reeve will be signing it. So please join me in welcoming Reeve Lindbergh.
You probably can't see it, but there are two big books here on the floor because I've been here before and they know how tall I am. So, thank you very much. I'm astonished. Usually I do kindergartens, and I have a very small crowd in all ways. So I'm really not used to having such a collection of people come to a book signing, but I'm very thrilled because I think this is the most important book, certainly for adults, that I have written, and I almost wrote it by accident because I started to write about my sister Anne after her death 5 years ago, and I did not want to write fiction, and I just wanted to talk about Anne. And as I began to write, I realized that this book was going to be about all of us, all our family, growing up together under a wing. The reason I chose that title was that in my father's book, The Spirit of St. Louis, he describes what it was like to be a young aviator in the 1920s and how they would land in a farmer's field sometimes where there were no trees. Maybe they were flying in the Midwest. He was flying with he had a lot of companions in his early flying days, other lunatics. Very young, these guys, young men and women sometimes, who really just wanted to fly and loved the freedom of that time. So they would maybe land in a farmer's field, one pilot or a couple of them, and the only shade on a hot summer's day was under the wing of the airplane. So they would sit under the wing and kind of swap stories and talk to the local farmers and anybody who came around. I hope the hay fields had been cut. I hope they didn't land in the fields before they'd been cut, but I'm sure they didn't. A lot of them were farm boys themselves. So what he said about it was that he said it's a sociable place under a wing. And good for business, too. He said people like to come and sit beside you, and they talk to each other, and they talk to you, and pretty soon they're kidding each other and into taking a flight over town. And he said, if you help them along a little, they're the best salesmen you could have. And I've found throughout my life, both writing and talking to people, either about my family or about the children's books, that people are mostly, well, very much the same, and we all have our families, we have our family stories. My own has had a kind of resonance of famous history, but families are in essence the same. And when we speak to each other of the things we care about most, there are no barriers, whether it's celebrity or history or even politics. Families are always, I think, made of the same thing. And one of the most important elements of family life is the affection we feel for our families, which I learned from my parents, who established, in spite of everything else that happened to them and around them, they established a very, very strong family life for their children. So when I wrote this book, I wanted to talk about how it felt to be part of our family, kind of looking out at the world, how it felt to be together in this rather unusual group of people, sheltered under the wings of my two famous parents. And I also wanted to share with others, as they have shared with me over the years, the phenomenon that my family was for them in the early years. I had a letter the other day from a man who must have been about my mother's age. He's now 92, and his handwriting was a little shaky. And he said, he didn't even write a heading, a greeting. He said, "Reeve, you have no idea how beautiful your mother was for us." That was all he said. You know, sincerely, so-and-so. And I had this whole evocative sense of what she meant, as I have had a sense of what he meant to those people who grew up during their time and who shared with them all the ups and downs of their lives, and who will sometimes share them with me. I was yesterday talking to a radio show out of Albany. The host was asking me questions, as they do, and then he had a call-in program, and a woman called in to say that she had been on a cruiser. I guess it was an Italian cruise line on a ship crossing the ocean, crossing the Atlantic, at the time that my father was attempting to make the flight. And at the middle of one of their meals, the Italian chef came up to her and her family, who were all Americans, and they said, "Your Charles Lindbergh has just landed in Paris." And they were so excited because they were an American family, and he was saying, "Your Charles Lindbergh has landed." And then, she said, and then he made a peanut brittle Spirit of St. Louis for all the kids. So she just called, I just learned this yesterday. I loved it. It just was such a wonderful story. And that was her connection with my family, was this peanut brittle Spirit of St. Louis. And there are all kinds of wonderful stories. But anyway, I'll read you a little bit of mine. And it goes like this. In kindergarten, one of my brothers told a friend on the playground that our father had discovered America. At about the same age, I dreamed that he was God. The relief brought by that revelation shone upon me the next morning like the bright rays of dawn. If our father was God, it explained everything. Why we called him Father, when all our friends called their fathers Daddy. Why he had so little contact with the other families around us, and yet so many people spoke about him with a kind of reverence. Why we had to eat Pepperidge Farm bread at home rather than Wonder Bread. Why the house shook when he was in a bad mood, and why I could find him in the Encyclopedia Britannica. I am the youngest child and second daughter of Charles A. and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. My father, Charles Augustus Lindbergh, became internationally famous in May 1927 for making the first non-stop solo flight from New York to Paris in a single-engine Ryan monoplane called the Spirit of St. Louis. He was 25 years old. My mother, Anne Morrow, met him in December of the following year when he made a goodwill trip to Mexico, where her father was serving as the American ambassador. She was 22. They were married in 1929 and lived together for more than 40 years until his death in 1974. As flyers, my mother and father explored the world together, mapping air routes for the aviation industry in its infancy. As writers, they published many accounts of their adventures and their thoughts. His best-known volume was The Spirit of St. Louis, describing the 1927 flight. Hers was Gift from the Sea, a philosophical meditation on women's lives in this century. When they were young parents, close to the beginning of their marriage, my father and mother suffered the death of their first child, Charles, as the result of a highly publicized kidnapping. My mother was pregnant at the time with her second son, my brother John. After John was born, my parents retreated from public life in order to raise him and then the rest of their children in protective privacy. They moved many times before I was born, seeking quiet and avoiding the press. They lived in England, in France, in Michigan, on Long Island, New York, and finally, just after the Second World War, bought the house in Darien, Connecticut, on the shores of Long Island Sound, where I grew up. Over the years, they became so successful at this effort to remove their family from the public eye that many people are unaware that there were more Lindbergh children after that first lost baby, whose story was so well known, and whose brothers and sisters never knew him at all. In fact, there were 5 of us: John, Land, Ann, Scott, and Reeve, 3 sons and 2 daughters. We grew up as the children of celebrities, but because our parents worked so hard to remove themselves from celebrity life, our understanding of what that meant was fluid and imperfect. It remains uncertain and idiosyncratic even today. We Lindberghs still know ourselves best as a tribe, close-knit, self-enclosed, and self-defining, always prepared to be besieged by invisible forces upwelling from the past: the famous flight, the kidnapping, the controversy over our father's isolationist stance just before the Second World War. Although it is now more than 20 years since he died, we are still directed and dominated by our father's strength of character. Although she is more than 90 years old, often confused in her mind and in fragile health at this writing, we are still redeemed, gentled, and sustained by our mother. "Was I married?" she will ask me, her eyes wide with astonishment at the thought. Or, "Are you my sister?" But when my own sister, her other daughter Anne, was dying, and I could do nothing to help Anne, could not stop the process, I put my arms around our mother and cried because I thought my heart was breaking, and also because I thought that she, my greatest comfort all my life, was now too disoriented even to understand what was going on. But my mother embraced me in return, and she wept too, in her flannel nightgown with the pink rosebuds on it. And she patted my head, and then she said exactly the right thing. "You never did anything wrong, Reeve. You never did anything wrong." It's extraordinary how she knows what to say. So, in our family, it's always been hard to know what is right and what is wrong in terms of what we can do for one another. It has been hard for us, too, to separate individual identity from family identity. As the youngest, I imagined growing up by virtue of a succession of transformations, becoming first one member of my family and then another, until I had been handed benevolently all the way up the line into adulthood. By the time I was 12, I would have my brother Scott's forgetfulness, his bashful grace, and his ability to befriend snakes and turtles. At 15, I would be Anne, with straight blonde hair and a blue and white checked bikini, small-featured and arrestingly lovely to look at, playing her flute with fingertips faintly scented by the oranges that came to us in crates from Florida once a month, which Anne peeled and ate, one after another, all day long. Later on, I would be Land, a cowboy and a cattleman, and then John, with mask and tanks and flippers, exploring the sea. Beyond John, there were only my parents. In trying to imagine who they were, entertaining the possibilities of who I could become through them, my images of entitled reincarnation blurred and became much vaguer, more diffuse, and thoroughly improbable. My sources for these imaginings ranged from the tabloids to my favorite fairy tales. And with their help, I would blend my parents' legendary, inaccessible accomplishments with my own fantasies, rescuing people from burning buildings, being president, being Peter Pan, flying without wings. We were not a typical 1950s suburban family. We never owned a television set during my father's lifetime. We did not attend church or belong to any community organizations. We were not allowed to eat candy or read comic books in the house. And when a biographer asked me recently whether my father knew who Elvis Presley was, I could not tell him. Not for sure. And that was Scott Berg. He came to our house and he sat me down for an interview. And I thought, all right, here it comes. And he said, "Reeve, did your father know who Elvis Presley was?" That was the first question he asked me. I said, boy, I didn't know. I would quite often find pictures of my father in books and magazines when I was growing up, and I would recognize him at once, even though the photographs invariably showed him as a young man in a flying helmet and had been taken almost 20 years before I was born. All the same, the boy flyer belonged to our family. I knew that. His eyes and nose, cheek and chin, his life and his story were unmistakably ours. If he was not exactly the father I knew, then he was like another older brother, living forever in the same image, in a life that did not touch but still ran parallel to my own. When I look at these photographs today, I react in the same way. This face is familiar and familial. It is part of me and what is mine, but it is also distant and inert. It will not move or speak. This face will remain stuck in its historical context, like a fly in amber, where it belongs. Once in a while, though, I come across a photograph of my father from my own childhood era, not the slim young man in the flying suit, but someone older, grayer, and heavier, with thinning hair. He's standing with a group of airline officials, perhaps, or among scientists at Bethesda Naval Hospital. He's wearing his navy blue pinstripe suit and is in his conversational stance. His head is slightly tilted for listening, partly because he's deaf in one ear from the engines of early airplanes, although he won't admit it, and partly because at 6'2" he's accustomed to talking with people who are not as tall as he is. His weight is off 1 foot, so he can rock back infinitesimally on the other. He's a shy, courteous man who will not inflict nervous agitation on himself or other people, but he's generally more comfortable in some degree of motion. His right arm is crooked at the elbow, and his right hand forms a loose fist, thumb pointed up. I am sure he's about to say something to his colleagues, and that he will begin with some cautious phrase like, "I think we have to remember." He will then punctuate his statement with a quick, emphatic jerk of that thumb, as some might point a forefinger, to make his point. I'm not at all sure, though, that he's going to stay on the page the way the boy aviator does. This man really is my father, after all, and he might walk right out of history and into his family life again, as he's done so many times before. He might walk across the gravel driveway, down the stone path, and through the arched front doorway of the old house in Connecticut where the rest of us are waiting, and then he will close the door behind him. So that's the beginning of the story. And I thought if anybody had questions, they might like to ask them, and I could talk a little more. Yes.
Is your mother still in Darien?
She is still in Darien, yes, and I just spoke with her this afternoon. My husband and I both had birthdays this weekend, and in fact, it would have been my sister's birthday, too. So we talked with her, and we asked her what she thought of the biography, because she has Scott's book, and Scott Berg, whom I know very well now, and my book. And what she said was, she doesn't ever say very much, but it's always to the point, and she said, "It's very heavy," she said. And then the other thing she said, my brother was there with her, and he asked her what she thought of all this stuff, you know, Scott Berg's book and my book, and there was a New York Times book review cover with a picture of my father, kind of an odd picture of my father and the airplane, and she looked at them all and she said, "Well, I'm for Lindbergh." So she tends to, she kind of saves it up, and then she says one little thing, and you think, oh yeah. No, but she is in Connecticut, and she's very well cared for. She has a lovely group of people there who are in fact Buddhists. That's part of their practice is care, and they're very gentle, and they're actually based in Vermont, and they have been caring for her for about 5 years now, and she's doing well. Very quiet, you know, not awfully well, but very, very happy, actually. Yes.
Did you come to love Hana, Hawaii, the way your dad did? And were you there? And if not, if you weren't there, why not? And
when he died, you mean?
Yeah.
He was, yes, I loved it very much. They bought land and built a house there not too many years before he died. And when he left the hospital in New York, he had lymphoma. And at a certain point, they said there really wasn't much more they could do for him. And he wanted to fly to Hawaii. But the hospital felt that this was not wise, that he should stay connected to the various machines. And he said, well, no, I think it's a philosophical decision. And he called his friend at Pan American. and they did, in fact, bring an aviation doctor who did sign him out of the hospital, said he would take responsibility. And he flew to Hawaii, and his 3 sons flew with him. They came from all over the world and flew with him. And his 2 daughters stayed in Maine. We were in, I was actually about to have a baby, and my sister and I were in North Haven, Maine, during that period together. And he was with the boys and my mother on a house by the sea that belonged to some friends of theirs. And he planned everything. He planned the the pieces that were to be read at his funeral with my mother, and he rehearsed the hymns that were to be sung. In other words, my mother would sing them, and my father would say, "That one's too corny." And he was doing this. And the Hawaiian, an old friend of his, a man named Tevi Kahalawahi, who was actually digging the grave, and my dad would talk to him about it. Tevi would come in and report. He'd say how it was wide and it was deep, and he said, Tevi used to call him Old Man, and he and Tevi were exactly the same age, but Tevi called him Old Man. He said, "Old Man," he said, "this is so beautiful, I'm going to jump in there with you." My father said, "That's fine, Tevi." But it was a remarkable time, and I got daily reports from my brothers of all that was going on. And then when they were finished digging for the day, at a certain point, there were a lot of them digging, my brothers and my father sent the guys down to the hamburger stand on the beach, because they get really hungry doing all this heavy stonework, because the Hawaiian graves are really made with stones, and many, many, many stones. That's how they do it. So it was a wonderful week for them, an extraordinary week. Yeah.
Do you need to go back there to feel close to your dad, or do you have enough really good, solid memories? You can just be anywhere. And
I can be anywhere. He was a lot of places, so so I nowhere in particular I have to be. I love to be in Minnesota. That's a great place to be with him along the Mississippi. Oh, I see a man who left a book with me. Yes.
A slightly modified question after your main comment, and really my wife Susan's question, but what is the connection with North Haven now? We often sail by Deacon Brown's Point, and I point out the guest house, and I say, I think that's still in the family.
Yes, it is. It belongs to my Aunt my mother's sister, Constance, owned that house, and her children still have it, so that my four cousins. So that house is still part of the family.
Father ever land on that field that everybody says was the field he landed on?
Yes, he did land on it. He wasn't in the spirit of St. Louis, but he did land on that field. They have a picture up there in the North Haven Historical Society. They have a picture of his I don't think it's a film, but they have a picture of him landing in that field. Yeah. Yes.
Two questions.
Yes.
One, did he have brothers and sisters? Were there other Lindberghs?
Yes, there were other Lindberghs. He had two half-sisters. And there were also relatives in Sweden, but his father had two daughters by his first wife before he married my grandmother. But he was the only child of that marriage, but he had two half-sisters.
And when did he last fly?
He last flew, and my father last flew in Vermont with my first husband, Richard Brown, in 1971 and 2. He flew over New England, and in fact, there's still a paperback. I think it's still in paper. View from the Air is a book of photographs that Richard took from those flights, and my father was the pilot flying that for that series of aerial photographs. Yeah. So he said he loved it. He flew out of Berlin, the Berlin airport, right near Montpelier, Vermont, and he said it was very much like his early flying experience, because there were very few airports, and he was flying in and out over farmland. So that was quite a wonderful time for him to be flying again over countryside. He loved it. But he used to go a little too low. He would tell Richard if he went low down to check out a farm or a little village, and he'd say, "You tell them you took this picture with a telephoto lens." so. He thought he was maybe a little too low for FAA standards. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to thank you for your book, The Names of Mountains. I can't remember.
The Names of the Mountains, yeah.
Thank you. I
Yes.
can't remember them.
Right.
And I also wanted to ask you, that book, I've read it a few times, and it's been a real comfort to me. But I also wanted to ask you, is it you that's Crescent Dragon Wagon, or is that your sister?
Oh no, neither one of us. But that's the best name for it? We often wondered who that was. No, Crescent Dragon Wagon is the name of a writer of children's books, and my sister could have been Crescent Dragon Wagon. She had very much that spirit, but no, she's not. Oh, wouldn't that be great? Oh, don't I wish? Yeah, she's a great. I love her work, but. Now, my other book, with The Names of the Mountains, which may be out of print now, was about the time when my mother first had some memory loss through stroke, and the family kind of came together over that incident. It's fictionalized and not entirely as it happened, but it's based on that time, which can be very confusing for families. Yes.
Did he coach Amelia Earhart at all?
He knew. They both knew Amelia Earhart. They didn't coach her. She was a pilot on her own, and I think no, she didn't need any coaching. But they did meet her, and thought she was a very interesting person. Yeah. Yes.
How does your siblings? You said you were all raised with this privacy around
Yes.
you. How do your siblings feel about the new biography and about you writing about your family life?
Well, they're handling it pretty well. They're doing pretty well. We knew that Scott was working on this book, and because he's been at it for 10 years. And in fact, he sent us at the end of April, when he finished the manuscript, he sent us the first copy for any corrections and so on. And my brothers, who are not that by profession writers, one of them called him, and he had said, I had a 2-hour conversation with your brother about all the typos in the book, just page by page. But there were a couple of errors where they said, well, so-and-so wasn't there, it was me, or I wasn't there, it was my other brother, and so he would correct those. For me, my brothers have called to change certain things that I remembered that they remembered differently. For instance, my oldest brother, John, who was the fisherman, and he's always been involved in aquaculture, and he was always out on the water when we were growing up. And he said, Reeve, there's a page where you write about me digging mussels at low tide in Long Island Sound. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. And he said, they were clams. And he said, you got your little necks, he said, and you got your chowders, and then you've got so this long this lot. I talked to Scott Berg about this, and he said, hey, you know what? He said he told me when I had a whole part about your brother in France from your mother's diaries about John cutting what were they, periwinkles? Probably was some mollusk. What would it have been? He was cutting something off the rocks. And your brother said to me, Scott, you don't cut them. And you pry them. So John apparently corrected us both about the mollusks and how you harvest them, and that was his area of expertise. And we made our changes, But they've been wonderful. I guess they've once in a while my brothers will call me up and they'll say, Reeve, just don't do anything for a while, okay? Just don't do anything. Just stop. But they're great. They've all read my book and loved it, actually. That's what they said. So, in fact, they read it. We were all together for my mother's 92nd birthday in June, and my brother Scott complained because he said, I was upstairs reading 800 pages of the biography, just going through the war years and the hard times and the trial and all that. And he said, and Land was downstairs cracking up over something you'd written in the beginning of your book. He says, no fair. If he's going to read your book, he's got to read it out of the house so I can get through this. So I think it was helpful for them to have something that was a little lighter coming out at the same time as this massive biography, which also presents a little bit sterner picture of our father, who had his very stern times. But when I knew him, I think that things were a little mellower, and so my picture of him is perhaps a little mellower in some ways. Yes?
What happened to you children when your parents were flying around together?
Well, for me, they were always the others, because I was the last one, and they weren't flying around so much. My mother was pretty much home by the time I was born. But with the others, there were nurses. They had sort of nanny kind of people, maybe who would be sort of au pairs at this point. The boys remember a Swiss woman named Serlisi, who I guess was a lovely young French Swiss who took care of them when they were little. My memory is pretty much of either having all the kids around, or my mother was pretty much home by the time I was born after the war. But yeah, they were there. It was a different world, and there were people always around to take care. But it was hard for my mother to take off like that after the kids were born. That was a bone of contention between them a little bit. I mean, she felt she wanted to be with him, but she did not want to leave the children. So that was, that's in the biography too. That was a hard thing for her after we were born to be quite as active flying off hither and yon. Although they did that again toward the end, which was wonderful to watch. When I was in my teens, they began to work, to fly around the world together, not in their own aircraft, but to fly they went to Africa, and they went, I think, to Japan again. They did a lot of flying for conservationist causes and events. And that was my one glimpse of what it must have been like for them to fly together as a couple in the early days. Yes?
I just wondered, you said you were sort of isolated, you know, as family. Did your parents entertain at the home, and if, you know, and bringing people in, and if so, were you involved in the, you know, allowed to mingle with the people that they brought in, or?
I could mingle with the guy in the green sweater right there. We mingled. Yeah, they did have good friends. Not so much locally, but my friend Jack Huber. Thank you very much for coming, Jack. And Jack would come in, and a lot of friends from New York usually would come out to the house and spend time with them. We were allowed to mingle. We had certain things we were supposed to be somewhat polite and removed a little bit, but we were fairly rambunctious, so that pardon, we weren't polite? We were not very polite. I'm sorry, excuse me, we were not terribly polite. No, not at all. That's not true. Okay. Well, just correct anything that I say. That's right. Okay. Well, I like to have an authority with me. You know, often I just write. Sometimes I have to call Scott Berg and say, Scott, what was I doing in 1953? And what's the name of that airplane? And he says, well, just a minute. And he looks it up in his notes. So I'm so glad I'm not a biographer. Yes.
People see your father as very courageous. I'm just curious, on a daily basis, someone like that, do you see evidence when you think back of, wow, what a brave act, what a courageous act? Nothing to do with flying, just like as a character that he exemplified on a relatively day-to-day basis.
What I saw was an amazing ability to respond to danger or any kind of extreme. I wrote a little bit about that. He was always alert and aware of what the weather was doing, or if there was a hurricane. In fact, he seemed to love it if something happened that was kind of out of the way. I wrote here once about flying with him when I was very little, and the automatic choke of the aircraft malfunctioned, so we basically had no engine. And what I remember best about that was not being afraid or thinking I was going to crash, but watching him just take over the situation and find the best way to get that airplane down. It was amazing to watch him in action when there was peril of any kind. He was remarkably alert and remarkably, seemed to me, remarkably trained to deal with any kind of danger or extremity. He was... That seemed to have been his training from very, very early on. As a child, he was really the man of the house. His parents separated when he was very young. And he would be the one who kind of brought in the wood and kept things going. He was driving his mother across the country when he was 14 years old, and he was the person who fixed the car if anything went wrong. And that sense of having to respond to any emergency was very present in him. Not so much, you know, doing something flashy or heroic, but just that if anything happened, he was going to take care of it, and it would be okay because he was there. So, yeah.
Did your father ever talk to you about his flying in the Pacific in World War II?
A little bit. He talked about it, but not so much. But he, of course, flew as a civilian in the Pacific, and because he was, for one thing, too old, and for another thing, he was not a favorite of President Roosevelt at that time. And but he did volunteer to go help the flyers in the Pacific, and he worked a lot with, I guess, fuel mixtures and oxygen mixtures to help the planes and the pilots fly more efficiently. And he actually, my mother said he loved that time, dangerous as it was for him, because as a civilian he would have been shot if he had been captured. I guess he didn't have any military status, but his and the fellows who were with him still meet. One of my nephews, Eric Lindbergh, is a pilot, and he met a couple of those guys and now goes back to their conventions, has a wonderful time with that crowd. That's quite a bunch of men, those flyers. But no, he loved that time. He was able to serve his country, and he was able to help out other aviators, and that was a great concern for him always. Yeah.
Have any of the other planes that he and your mother flew early on been preserved, or only the Spirit of Philip?
Oh no, the plane that they flew in, called the Lockheed Sirius, that's called the Tingmissartoq, which was I believe an Eskimo name that was given to it, which meant something like "he who flies like a bird." That plane is also in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum with a lot of their materials and their flight suits and so on, or pictures of them. So there is that one, and there may be others, but those are the two that I know of, and those are right there at the Air and Space Museum. Yeah.
Did one or both of your parents evolve into conservationists at the same time, or did one heavily influence the other?
I think they both developed in that direction, in the direction of conservation and preservation of the environment, although she, I think, was much more philosophically inclined that way from the very beginning. And he, toward the end of his life, took a great deal of action. He went out and joined groups and talked and in fact began to use the media, which he had avoided, to promote the cause of the, saving the whale or the monkey-eating eagle in the Philippines, or to talk about preserves and parks. But, and that was great to see, to watch him go back into this arena that had been so hard for him in order to espouse the cause he cared about. But I do think that they evolved together to a great extent toward this kind of a vision. If you read their writings, one of the interesting things is that you will see toward the later writings, they don't write in each other's style because they couldn't. They're just way too different. But they begin almost to use each other's words, which is very interesting to watch the way that you can tell that the conversation was constant. And she will talk about things like selection and balance, which were his kind of watchwords. And he has almost a more literary vocabulary toward the end of his life. But he still used a lot of hyphens. I remember they used to drive me crazy. Yes?
First of all, I want to compliment your writing. You may have two very famous parents, but your writing is very beautiful.
Thank you.
And it's nice to meet you and to hear. I don't know how many times I've given this as a gift.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could speak to anyone that hasn't read it. And as a writer and as a daughter, when your mother talks about the transitions of life, and especially when she writes 20 years later, if you could just comment on how you...
Well, Gift from the Sea, which is a little book, if anybody hasn't read it, of 127 pages long, which is one of my favorite books in the world, and I think has helped generation after generation of women. In fact, a friend of mine, Ann Johnson, just wrote a book called Return to the Sea, just about how much that book helped her, and she's just published it, and it's a beautiful little volume by Innisfree, I think, Innisfree Press in Wisconsin, and she wrote just chapter by chapter what each of these things has meant to her in her own life. And this is a woman in her 30s or 40s raising children now, and about a book that was written back in 1955. But my mother talks about every stage of a woman's life, and especially of married life, using the metaphor of the shells that she found on the beach in Captiva when she was there long ago. And I think she has something to give us at every stage. She wanted to write a book, a sort of gift from the sea for aging, for older age, and was not able to do that. But I think the material is there, so I think maybe there'll be a time when we can find some of that and put it together, because she had so much to say, and she talked a lot about what it was like getting older and being without my father, and what that part of life was like. And she didn't have time to pull it together and publish it, but that was her wish, so we're hoping we can do that for her at some time, and it'd be another gift for a different time in life.
When did you know that you were going to be a writer, and when did you begin writing?
I did a little writing, always, as a child, not thinking I'd be a writer, but just because everybody else did. so keep diaries, and they, I think was maybe when I first had children, the worst possible time I thought, I think I'd like to be a writer, and and I would do a little bit during nap times, and I showed a short story, a little piece I'd done to my mother's editor, who was a very close friend of ours, Helen Wolfe, and she said, you really should think about doing this more seriously. And so I started to begin to submit things, and did not publish. I mean, lots of them, they said, no, forget it, we're not interested. And then eventually I did publish more. I sort of slipped into it, I think. And now I of course write all the time, but I have a lot of friends who are writers, some unpublished and kind of moving in that direction, some who think, I'm just writing for fun, who I believe will be published writers. But you sort of slip into it by continuing to write and taking it seriously and working with other writers. I don't know whether that's a personal question or just it happens in a lot of different ways at surprising times. Yes.
Any chance that names of the mountains would be reprinted?
Oh yes, clamor. Call my publisher and clamor for a reprint. It might be. I mean, it might be.
Give put away as a present and found to my horror that it
You
was
couldn't find it?
outside.
I'll tell you, I know where you can find it. I have it. Our local bookstore usually can have it, usually has it, but yes.
Your name is intriguing. Is it
Yes.
a name that you have come to feel, we come to feel our names sometimes? Do you identify with this?
I do now. My name Reeve. Yeah, I didn't like it when I was growing up. I wanted to be Peggy, and then I'm just a name. But my roommate in college was named Peggy and said you don't want that name. But I do. I love it now because it's part of the family, and it goes back a long way in my mother's family. It was her sister's middle name, and it was a surname in the family. All our names are have previous owners. We have names that go back through the generations. So now it's funny how you sort of get used to yourself. You get used to your name, you get used to your hair, you get used to your nose. All those things you can't stand when you're younger. So now I'm quite fond of it now. Yeah. Yes.
I never asked you this, but your grandmother told me that your father,
yes,
when he got in the plane,
yes,
took 4 letters of introduction because he wouldn't know anybody in Paris.
Yes, this is true. Yes, it's true. Well, you read Scott's book, right? So I always was told that, and nobody can believe it. He had no idea that there'd be that kind of reception. Hundreds of thousands of lights. He took introductions, and one of them was to the mother of Nungaser, who was killed making the attempt to fly the other way, and that was something that he and my mother also did. They also always made contact with the sort of the brotherhood and sisterhood of the air, the other aviators, because he said that whatever they did was always part of a much larger accomplishment by all the aviators, from the Wright brothers back to all and forward to everybody who ever flew. There was a great deal of respect for the other flyers. And in fact, I was doing a book about Bessie Coleman, who's the first licensed African-American aviator in the world, and whom I love. I had learned about her when I was supposed to be going to a big party for my father's 60th or 50th anniversary of his flight to Paris, and I instead was having a baby, so I was doing that quite a lot. So I was watching TV, and there was this incredible film called Flyers in Search of a Dream, and it was produced by a man whose great uncle was an early African-American aviator, a man named Phil Hart, and the great uncle was, I think it was Herman Banning. And I called him up and I found him because I said, "Oh, you got to write a book for children." He said, "Who's this?" But he did actually. He wrote a book for children, and his family is doing quite a lot of that now. But those guys were the early African American aviators. They weren't allowed to go in the flying schools. They couldn't get aircraft. And I was telling my mother about this, and she said, "Oh, yes, we know about them." And then she said, "Your father met a bunch of the guys in California when he was flying, some of the early African American aviators." And she said, we thought they were the bravest ones of all because they had nothing. And Bessie Coleman was told she couldn't get into flying school, she couldn't get a license. What she did was she went to France, got her license over there. First licensed African American aviator in the world, and she just went and did it. And she crashed and she died actually a year before my father even flew the Atlantic. So there was a lot going on with the early aviators in this country and around the world before my parents even set foot in an airplane. Brave. Unbelievable, those people. Yes.
You said that your father mellowed as he got older. What is your most tender memory that you have being the youngest of your father?
My father? Okay, I think it was very late in his life when he was ill and I didn't know it, and he was in Hawaii, and he was always telling you that the nature had its ways and they weren't always kind and all that kind of stuff. And he said there was a dog that my mother and I were feeding. Looked like a dog who had just had puppies, and she very thin. And she would kind of slink around the houses at night, and my mother and I were always slipping her food. And my father said, this isn't really nature's way. Do you really think what'll happen when we leave? And is this really the wise thing to do? And my mother and I kind of looked at each other and kept feeding the dog. And then I went to bed at night, and and he was kind of sitting out on the porch and looking out over the ocean. I didn't know it then, but he had already been diagnosed with cancer. And he was looking out at the ocean, and I was looking out over the balcony toward where he was sitting. And I saw something, and the dog was right next to him, and he was feeding it his dinner. And I loved watched it because he didn't know I was watching him. But that told me something about him that was very important to me. You know, he talked a good game, but he was going to feed the dog too. Yeah. Yeah.
Did your father encourage the children to fly? And did any of you get pilot's license or take lessons?
He did not encourage us because he felt it was a completely different profession, much more of a professional world at that time. It wasn't so much a pioneering field at the time that he said if you want to be a commercial pilot or go into the Army or the Air Force, that's fine. But it's not, I mean, if you want to do something new, then I recommend that you go out into some other area. And in fact, all three of my brothers did, although I think John does have, the oldest one, does have a pilot's license. And Scott, who works with, he works with endangered species in Brazil, in fact, and he's married to a Brazilian. But he used ultralights to sort of survey the canopy in the forest, and he enjoyed that a lot. But I don't think Land has a license. His son does, actually. There are a bunch in the next generation. A lot of the grandchildren are pilots. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
How many grandchildren are there?
15. At last count. And there are eight grades. So there are a lot of us, about 30 of us now, from all the 4 generations. Yeah. Yes.
I don't remember, but was your mother a pilot too?
Yeah, she was.
Didn't they chart the Pacific Airway routes?
They did a lot of charting for TAT and Pan American, as it was then. It was NTWA. They did a lot of that survey work, and they pioneered the Great Circle route over the pole for Asia. She wrote about that. But they did a lot in South America and a certain amount in Europe also. Yeah. She was a glider pilot also. She was the first woman to get a license as a glider pilot in this country. So, and she loved that. She liked that best because there was not noisy. She said you could hear the birds and the crickets, and that she thought that was great. So.
Maine influence, probably, right?
Yeah, that was probably Maine. But she actually, when she read North of the Orient, she wrote, they stopped in Maine. That's a wonderful little section, maybe you've seen it. Yeah, I love that. That's just writing about the islands and coming in off the ocean. Any questions? Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Reeve will be next door at Water Street Bookstore signing, and if you could just wait for just a minute and come join us. Without the books.
All right. Best directory of recommended insurance attorneys and adjusters. Volume 1 and 2. Has had a kind of resonance of famous history, but families are in essence the same. And when we speak to each other of the things we care about most, there are no barriers, whether it's celebrity or history or even politics. Families are always, I think, made of the same thing. And one of the most important elements of family life is the affection we feel for our families, which I learned from my parents, who established, in spite of everything else that happened to them and around them, they established a very, very strong family life for their children. So when I wrote this book, I wanted to talk about how it felt to be part of our family, kind of looking out at the world, how it felt to be together in this rather unusual group of people, sheltered under the wings of my 2 famous parents. And I also wanted to share with others, as they have shared with me over the years, the phenomenon that my family was for them in the early years. I had a letter the other day from a man who must have been about my mother's age. He's now 92, and his handwriting was a little shaky. And he said, he didn't even write a heading, a greeting. He said, "Reeve, you have no idea how beautiful your mother was for us." That was all he said. Sincerely. so-and-so. And I had this whole evocative sense of what she meant, as I have had a sense of what he meant to those people who grew up during their time and who shared with them all the ups and downs of their lives, and who will sometimes share them with me. I was yesterday talking to a radio show out of Albany. The host was asking me questions, as they do, and then he had a call-in program, and a woman called in to say that she had been on a cruiser. Now, I guess it was an Italian cruise line on a ship crossing the ocean, crossing the Atlantic, at the time that my father was attempting to make the flight. And at the middle of one of their meals, the Italian chef came up to her and her family, who were all Americans, and they said, "Your Charles Lindbergh has just landed in Paris." And they were so excited because they were an American family, and he was saying, "Your Charles Lindbergh has landed." And then, she said, and then he made a peanut brittle Spirit of St. Louis for all the kids. So she just called, I just learned this yesterday. I loved it. It just was such a wonderful story. And that was her connection with my family, was this peanut brittle Spirit of St. Louis. And there are all kinds of wonderful stories. But anyway, I'll read you a little bit of mine. And it goes like this. In kindergarten, one of my brothers told a friend on the playground that our father had discovered America. At about the same age, I dreamed that he was God. The relief brought by that revelation shone upon me the next morning.
Of programs covering books, authors, and the publishing industry. Write us with your comments or suggestions at 400 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001, or call us at area code 202-626-4898. This is a book written by the daughter of aviator Charles Lindbergh. Under a Wing is Reeve Lindbergh's memoir of life in the famous household headed by Charles and his wife, author Morrow Lindbergh. Earlier this month, their youngest child spoke at Water Street Bookstore in Exeter, New Hampshire. Under a Wing is our biography selection this weekend.
This is on, I assume. Okay. Good evening and welcome to Water Street Bookstore. Tonight we are delighted to have Reeve Lindbergh here to read from her new book, Under a Wing, her loving memoir of growing up as the youngest child of Charles Lindbergh and Morrow Lindbergh. It is a remarkable portrait of her two famous parents, as individuals, as a couple, and as mother and father to Reeve, her sister, and three brothers. Moving back and forth between her childhood in Connecticut and her adult life in Vermont, Reeve offers us glimpses into a life filled with family adventures, happiness, and sorrow. It is in her gift of sharing the memories that bind
Under a Wing. The reason I chose that title was that in my father's book, The Spirit of St. Louis, he describes what it was like to be a young aviator in the 1920s and how they would land in a farmer's field sometimes where there were no trees. Maybe they were flying in the Midwest. He was flying with he had a lot of companions in his early flying days, other lunatics. Very young, these guys, young men and women sometimes, who really just wanted to fly and loved the freedom of that time. So they would maybe land in a farmer's field, one pilot or a couple of them, and the only shade on a hot summer's day was under the wing of the airplane. So they would sit under the wing and kind of swap stories and talk to the local farmers and anybody who came around. I hope the hay fields had been cut. I hope they didn't land in the fields before they'd been cut, but I'm sure they didn't. A lot of them were farm boys themselves. So what he said about it was that he said it's a sociable place under a wing. And good for business, too. He said people like to come and sit beside you, and they talk to each other, and they talk to you, and pretty soon they're kidding each other into taking a flight over town. And he said, if you help them along a little, they're the best salesmen you could have. And I've found throughout my life, both writing and talking to people either about my family or about the children's books, that people are mostly Well, very much the same, and we all have our families, we have our family stories, my own.
And this incredible family together that makes Under a Wing such a poignant tribute to the Lindberghs and the Morrows, those that have died and those that survive. Reeve is the author of 2 novels, The Names of the Mountains and Moving to the Country, as well as numerous children's books. She lives in Vermont with her husband, writer Nathaniel Tripp, and their family. After the reading, there will be an opportunity for you to ask Reeve questions, and then we'll be moving next door where you can purchase the book, and Reeve will be signing it. So please join me in welcoming Reeve Lindbergh.
You probably can't see it, but there are 2 big books here on the floor because I've been here before and they know how tall I am. So, thank you very much. I'm astonished. Usually I do kindergartens, and I have a very small crowd in all ways. So I'm really not used to having such a collection of people come to a book signing, but I'm very thrilled because I think this is the most important book, certainly for adults, that I have written, and I almost wrote it by accident because I started to write about my sister Anne after her death 5 years ago, and I did not want to write fiction, and I just wanted to talk about Anne. And as I began to write, I realized that this book was going to be about all of us, all our family, growing up together.